The town hall began with applause for quarterly results, but it ended with CFO Martin Hale cutting me down in front of the entire company. One moment I was the compliance director who had spent years protecting billion-dollar contracts. The next, I was dismissed like an afterthought. The smirk on VP Sophie Grant's face told me this was more than cost-cutting. It was humiliation. I said nothing. They thought they had erased me. What they didn't know was that one overlooked clause, written years earlier, could unravel everything they believed they controlled. Don't scroll. This gets explosive fast. Comment your city now, subscribe, and stay with me because the smallest detail flipped their empire upside down. The spotlight hit me like a slap. We were all gathered in the atrium for the quarterly town hall, the kind of staged performance where the leadership paraded success in front of staff. CFO Martin Hale stood on the stage in his tailored suit, the microphone clutched in his hand like a weapon. His voice carried easily through the room. As part of our restructuring, we are eliminating redundant positions, he announced, pausing just long enough to let the tension build. Then his eyes locked on me. Effective immediately, Diana Mercer will no longer be with the company. The silence that followed burned hotter than applause. I felt every pair of eyes slide toward me, some wide with shock, most quickly averting out of fear. Sophie Grant, the VP of Operations, smirked as if she had just won a private bet. I wanted to speak, to defend the years I had kept federal regulators off this company's back, but my throat tightened and no words came. My body moved on instinct. Stand, gather my bag, walk out. While Martin kept talking as though I were a line item erased from a spreadsheet. I could feel humiliation crawl under my skin, a hot mix of anger and disbelief, but I refused to give them the tears they were waiting for. They thought they had buried me in front of everyone. What they didn't realize was that beneath their polished empire lay a fault line, and one overlooked detail was enough to split it wide open. When I stepped outside the glass doors that afternoon, the air was heavy with humiliation, but under it sat something sharper. Memory. Martin believed he had ended me with a public dismissal. Sophie believed her smirk sealed my irrelevance, but neither of them remembered the contract language they had signed years ago without a second glance. That language was my design. As compliance director, I had been tasked to craft a master clause for our federal contracts, a safeguard meant to prevent fraud and ensure accountability. My solution was simple but absolute. All contract renewals and payouts above a certain threshold required the personal countersignature of the designated compliance officer. That officer was me, by name, not by job title. They had thought it a formality, another signature among many. They never asked why I insisted on embedding it directly into the agreements, never noticed the way regulators quietly approved, never considered the long-term implications. To them, I was invisible, a paper pusher buried in back-office details. To me, it was armor. When Martin announced my firing, he assumed compliance was just another department he could reshuffle. He assumed authority ended with his voice and Sophie's applause. What he didn't realize was that the entire stream of government money flowing into this company ran through my pen. One signature withheld, one form delayed, one request flagged, and millions would freeze overnight. That was the weakness they couldn't see, the fault line beneath the marble floors of their boardroom. I didn't plan to reveal it yet. David, my old mentor, had once told me the system always underestimates the quiet players, and he was right. My power was not in shouting back at Martin's stage, but in letting him believe I was gone while the structure he relied on shifted under his feet. They fired me thinking the story had ended, but what they had really done was hand me the perfect moment to pull the first thread loose. The building's applause still echoed in my ears as I sat alone that evening, the cardboard box of my belongings dumped on the floor of my apartment. Inside it were meaningless relics, a mug, a pen, a framed certificate. But none of that mattered. What mattered was the quiet authority no one else remembered, the one thread woven into every government contract we held. They believed I was finished. I believed the real game was about to begin. I powered on my laptop and opened the encrypted portal regulators used for compliance verification. My login still worked because it had to. My name, not my role, was written into the contracts as the sole authorizer. With 3 keystrokes, I filed a formal hold request. It was a dry, clinical action, flagging a pending review across every active contract. The words on the screen looked harmless, but I knew the effect would not be. In 48 hours, payouts totaling more than $300 million would halt until the hold was lifted. Payrolls would be delayed, vendor invoices suspended, and the government would demand clarification. I hit submit and leaned back, my chest tight, not from fear, but from clarity. Martin Hale had spent the afternoon gloating, probably at a bar with Sophie, raising a glass to my erasure. He had no idea that even as he clinked ice in his whiskey glass, the foundation of his empire had already shifted. My phone buzzed with messages from colleagues, condolences, awkward words about how unfair it was. But I replied to none. They couldn't know. Silence was my weapon, and timing was everything. I poured a glass of wine and studied the city skyline outside my window, the glittering towers that looked so solid from a distance. I knew better. Corporations looked permanent until you saw the contracts propping them up. I had written those contracts. I knew exactly where the weak points lived. Tomorrow the whispers would begin, vendors wondering why payments hadn't landed, managers fielding confused calls, accountants scrambling to reconcile numbers that no longer matched. By the end of the week, the board would sense something was wrong, and only then would I step back into the room. Not as the redundant compliance director they mocked, but as the one person with the authority to restore what they had carelessly broken. My action tonight was small, quiet, invisible to the untrained eye, but it was the first domino, the trigger that would send the others toppling. While Martin Hale strutted in front of the cameras and Sophie Grant practiced her speeches, the system they thought they controlled had already slipped from their grasp. They didn't know it yet, but the moment I clicked submit, their countdown began. By midweek, the first signs of strain had begun to surface. I didn't need inside access to hear it. The calls came to me indirectly, whispered from former colleagues and forwarded messages from vendors desperate for answers. Contractors who had never spoken my name were suddenly asking if I could clarify the hold that froze their invoices. Martin brushed it off at first. Administrative delays, he told staff, waving his hand as if $300 million could be explained away with a shrug. Sophie tried her version of control, sending chirpy memos promising process improvements. But panic spreads faster than reassurance. The finance teams knew something was off. Their dashboards showed numbers that didn't reconcile, payouts queued but never executed, government confirmations missing. By Thursday morning, I received a text from Nell, one of the few allies who still dared to reach out. They're blaming IT, but people know it's bigger. Rumor is your name is still on the contracts. I smiled when I read that. Rumors are the first cracks. They move faster than truth and shake confidence before proof arrives. Martin didn't realize that dismissing me in public had made his problem worse. By humiliating me so openly, he had given everyone a reason to look for shadows behind the curtain, and they were starting to see them. My role now was patience. I stayed quiet, kept my profile invisible, and let their arrogance do the work. Each day without payments meant more whispers, more uncertainty, more calls bouncing between regulators and executives who had no authority to fix it. I could almost picture Martin pacing in his office, red-faced, barking at his team, convinced that control was still his. He hadn't yet realized that the control he clung to was an illusion. The first crack had appeared, and no matter how loudly he denied it, the foundation was already shifting beneath his feet. By Friday morning, the whispers had turned into open panic. The regulators had formally acknowledged the compliance hold, confirming what Martin and Sophie had tried to dismiss all week. Contractors were calling hourly, their voices sharp with fury as millions of dollars in payments froze midstream. Internal finance staff were being grilled by vendors demanding answers they didn't have, and the government liaison sent a terse notice. Until compliance signatures were restored, no disbursements would move forward. That single line was enough to paralyze the system. I didn't need to be in the building to know the chaos inside. Reports reached me through Nell, through late-night calls from old colleagues who suddenly wanted my insight, through snippets of leaked memos that made their way across chat threads. Auditors arrived unannounced, demanding access to records. Federal monitors scheduled emergency meetings. The press smelled blood and began circling, publishing vague articles about contracting irregularities tied to the company. Martin reacted the only way he knew how, by tightening his grip. He berated managers, threatened IT, and held late-night meetings where he swore he would get control back. Sophie pushed out desperate communications, insisting everything was on track, even as staff whispered about delayed payrolls and slashed vendor orders. Every lie widened the crack. Investors noticed too. Shares slipped as analysts downgraded outlooks, citing regulatory instability. Anderson Capital, one of the company's largest stakeholders, leaked word that they were reviewing governance structures. That phrase alone sent the board scrambling. They had gambled that firing me was a show of strength. Now they looked like gamblers losing their shirts at the table. And I stayed silent. I didn't call regulators. I didn't leak documents. I didn't step into the press storm. I simply let the machine they had mocked me for maintaining grind to a halt without my hand to guide it. The irony was sharp enough to taste. For years they had told me compliance was paperwork, a nuisance that slowed deals. Now the same paperwork was suffocating them. It wasn't revenge. It was math. A missing signature equaled frozen contracts. No rhetoric, no speeches, just silence turning into pressure. By the weekend, Sophie was reportedly in tears after a call with auditors. Martin, however, still postured, insisting he had solutions coming. His arrogance blinded him to the truth that the collapse was already underway. Regulators don't move at the pace of corporate ego. They move at the pace of law, and the law was on my side. I sat in my apartment, documents neatly arranged in a locked drawer, and watched the headlines multiply. Federal contracts in limbo. Audit teams enter headquarters. Investors question leadership stability. To anyone else, it looked like sudden disaster. To me, it was exactly what I had designed years ago. A safeguard meant to protect the company from reckless executives. The clause was never about me, but now it was the lever I held. The chain reaction had begun, and with each passing day, the board's empire weakened under its own weight. Their mistake wasn't firing me. Their mistake was underestimating the quiet architecture of control I had built beneath their feet. On Monday morning, I returned to the glass tower they thought I'd been banished from. The security guard hesitated at first, remembering the public dismissal, but I handed him a sealed envelope with my attorney's letterhead. Inside was the regulator's confirmation, notarized and signed. Until my compliance signature returned, no federal contract payouts could proceed. His face changed instantly. Within minutes, I was escorted upstairs, not as an employee, but as someone they hadn't yet realized they could not ignore. The boardroom was a theater of panic disguised as order. Martin Hale sat at the head of the table, his tie loosened, jaw clenched tight. Sophie Grant was beside him, pale, clutching a folder like it might shield her from reality. The directors looked tired, defensive, their eyes darting to me as I entered. Martin's voice cut the silence. "This meeting is closed. Miss Mercer, you're no longer employed here." I didn't flinch. I slid the folder across the polished mahogany table. "Then you'll want to read this." The chairman opened it first. His hands shook as his eyes scanned the regulator's letter, then widened in disbelief. One by one, the others leaned in, whispers breaking into frantic murmurs. Finally, the chairman spoke, his voice unsteady. This says you are the sole compliance officer authorized for federal contracts." I met his gaze. "Correct. By name. Not by role. My authority doesn't disappear because Martin wanted a spectacle." Martin slammed his fist on the table. "This is outrageous." "You're bluffing. Regulators don't care about signatures." As if on cue, my phone buzzed. I placed it face up on the table. The name flashing across the screen was the Department of Defense Contracting Office. The room froze. I answered calmly. "Yes. This is Diana Mercer." I listened for a moment, then replied, "Of course. I'll continue coordinating to ensure compliance remains intact." "Thank you." I ended the call and looked around the table. They already know. They are watching closely. And they will not release $1 until I sign. Sophie's lips parted, but no words came out. One director leaned back in his chair, exhaling loudly. Another muttered, "My God, we didn't see this coming." Martin's face flushed crimson. "You can't possibly expect to run this company. You're nothing but—" "The only person," I interrupted, my tone sharp but steady, "who can restore the contracts you are bleeding dry. Investors already know the truth. Auditors already know the truth. And if you continue to fight me, regulators will escalate until you're personally liable for obstruction." The silence that followed was thick, broken only by the faint hum of the air conditioning. For the first time, Martin looked small. His bluster collapsed under the weight of something he couldn't intimidate or outshout: documented law. The chairman cleared his throat. "Martin, if this is valid, and it appears it is, we cannot ignore it. Our survival depends on her cooperation." Martin barked, "You're siding with her? After everything?" "After everything," the chairman said coldly, "we are staring at insolvency. And she is the only one with leverage to stop it." Martin pushed back his chair, shaking his head, his voice cracking with fury. "This is betrayal." I met his eyes. "No, Martin. Betrayal is humiliating me in front of the company, thinking you could erase me. This is consequence." He tried to speak again, but the chairman raised his hand. "Martin Hale, in light of this evidence, the board accepts your resignation effective immediately." The words landed heavier than any gavel. Sophie covered her mouth, stunned, as Martin stormed out, muttering curses under his breath. The board turned to me, their expressions a mixture of fear and reluctant respect. I gathered my papers calmly, the same way I had walked out of that town hall days earlier. Only this time, I wasn't leaving in disgrace. "Gentlemen," I said, rising to my feet, "you wanted me gone. Instead, I'm the only reason you still have a company. Tomorrow, we restructure properly. Today, you accept reality." I walked out to the corridor lined with assistants and junior staff pretending not to listen, their eyes following me with a new recognition. For the first time, the weight of power had shifted. The collapse was complete, not with shouting or spectacle, but with silence, documents, and one overlooked clause that brought an empire to its knees. By the afternoon, the news had already broken. Headlines flashed across financial sites. CFO, Martin Hale, resigns amid compliance crisis. Analysts speculated about leadership instability, but the market responded more calmly once investor statements confirmed support for interim measures. In less than a day, the story shifted from chaos to restoration, and my name, once erased publicly, was suddenly everywhere. The board, cornered and exhausted, voted unanimously to appoint me interim CEO. Not because they admired me, not because they wanted me, but because they had no other choice if they wanted to salvage contracts and credibility. Regulators demanded a governance overhaul, investors demanded stability. I demanded compliance independence, permanent oversight, and the immediate suspension of Sophie Grant, pending an audit of her dealings. They agreed, their arrogance dissolved into silence. Walking into the executive suite felt surreal. The same offices where I had been dismissed as irrelevant now opened to me with deference. Assistants who had looked away at the town hall now greeted me with cautious respect. Nell texted me a single line, "Never seen so many people remember your name so fast." She was right. The same people who had laughed in private days earlier now scrambled to realign under my authority. But I didn't feel triumph. What I felt was responsibility. The contracts weren't just numbers. They represented employees waiting on paychecks, contractors depending on stability, clients relying on delivery. Martin and Sophie had treated the system like their playground. I knew better. Power wasn't a performance. It was accountability. And now it rested on me. That night, I sat alone in the corner office, the skyline glowing against the glass, the hum of the city steady and indifferent. The chair beneath me had once belonged to Martin, But it didn't feel like a prize. It felt like a burden finally placed where it belonged. I thought back to the town hall, the smirk on Sophie's face, the sting of humiliation when Martin announced my erasure. They believed power was loud, public, undeniable. They were wrong. Power is quiet, embedded in systems no one bothers to understand until those systems stop working. The clause I had written years earlier was never meant for revenge. It was meant as a safeguard, a firewall against recklessness. They ignored it because they ignored me, and that blindness destroyed them more effectively than anything I could have orchestrated. Investors, regulators, employees, they weren't celebrating me as a hero. They were relieved that someone had restored stability. That was enough. For years I had been overlooked, dismissed as the woman behind the paperwork. But when the collapse came, it was the paperwork that decided who stood and who fell. Martin Hale lost his position. Sophie Grant faced her own reckoning, and the board had no choice but to admit the truth. The system they mocked had been their lifeline all along. I didn't smile, not even as messages poured in congratulating me. Instead, I whispered a reminder to myself: power isn't about spectacle, it's about patience. One overlooked detail can bring an empire to its knees, and one steady hand can rebuild it. They fired me to erase me, but in doing so, they revealed the fragility of their own empire, and in the silence that followed, I became its keeper. I learned something from my own humiliation that I could never have learned from success. Systems don't collapse because of one dramatic blow. They collapse because leaders ignore the cracks beneath their feet. When Martin Hale fired me in front of the company, he believed power was public and absolute. But the systemic flaw was already written into every contract he relied on. He overlooked it because he overlooked me, and that blindness became his undoing. This matters in American corporate life because companies today are built on fragile networks, compliance, contracts, data integrity, that executives often dismiss as details. When those details are ignored, the entire structure can unravel in days. You should feel validated if you've ever been the one whose warnings went unheard or whose work was dismissed as irrelevant. The story proves that arrogance has a short shelf life, and sometimes justice arrives not through shouting, but through the systems arrogant people thought they controlled. The takeaway is simple: fragility hides in plain sight. Executives who prioritize optics over infrastructure set themselves up for collapse. The real safeguard isn't charisma, it's documentation, accountability, and respect for the systems that look boring until they stop working. How to get started today. Document every safeguard you create. Your work may be invisible until it's indispensable. Pay attention to the boring rules, compliance, safety checks, redundancies, because they are the backbone of stability. Don't rush to react when overlooked. Patience often turns arrogance into its own downfall. Remember, one overlooked clause, file, or safeguard can be the fulcrum of accountability. Before you go, tell me in the comments, have you ever watched arrogance lead to collapse? Share your story, and don't forget to like and subscribe, because the next tale will hit even closer to home.